Okay. Streaming looks fine. Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Oh, very good. Welcome to you all. Welcome also to all of you attending the Satsang online. We have lots of great questions. Let me just get started here. First question from Maya, who lives in Singapore. How do we know that the subtle body has actually left the physical body in the hospital when the doctors I'm paraphrasing, the doctors have put a body on this breathing machine, keeping the body alive. And it's sometimes difficult to judge when a person is truly dead. The first problem is we're mixing two worldviews here. Sukshma Sharira is part of an ancient worldview, and whatever's going on in a physical body is part of the modern worldview. And you can't really mix them. You can go with one or the other. They're incompatible systems. So choose one, choose the other. From a medical standpoint, they go by, I think the correct term is brain death. When the remember, it's the back of the brain that makes your heart beat and your lungs breathe. So when that part of the brain is gone, the front part of the brains can go earlier, but when that back part of the brainstem that makes your heart beat, when that's gone, it's over. Yeah, and there is zero possibility of any kind of recovery, and that would be death. From a Hindu perspective, how to know when the body is dead. In ancient times, they didn't have what is it? ECG machines to measure brain activity, or EKG machines to measure heart activity. So they use common sense to know when the Sukshma Sharira left the physical body. And there's no harm in using common sense today either. And that is when doctors have determined that the part of the brain that controls the heart and respiration, when that part of the brain has ceased to become functional, the doctor says the person is no more. I think it's a safe assumption at that point that the Sukshma Sharira has left. Is there any way to determine it more specifically? None whatsoever, because there's no way for us to detect the presence or absence of Sukshma Sharira. It's not a physical entity that we can measure in any way whatsoever. Next question from Gomadi, who lives in Florida. Question about mantras used in temples, in homa, fire rituals, archanas, rituals at an altar, kumbhabhishekams, the consecration of temples, and all Hindu rituals. My understanding is all the mantras originated from the 4 Vedas and are not specific to any god. And there are actually 2 errors in that statement. We'll come back to that. My understanding is mantras originated from the 4 Vedas and are not specific to any gods. And most of the stories I've heard so far are from the Upanishad, and they talk about Brahman, Tattvamasi, which is good. Then why do we have so many mantras specific to each god? Maybe better to say each form of God, since we understand from the Hindu perspective is one God worshipped in many forms, many aspects. And why are there so many different rituals for different gods, and all of which have different mantras? So there are some some confusion here about what is the Vedic perspective on so many gods. The statement you've already heard a quote, but you may have heard it mistranslated. The quote is Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Varanti. This comes in the Rig Veda itself, and actually I think fairly early in the Rig Veda, which means towards the beginning of it. Ekam Sat, which most people mistranslate as truth is one. Vipraha, the wise ones, Bahudha Varanti, they describe that one, quote, truth in many ways. I've discussed this in several classes. This is one of the most widely misquoted and misunderstood statements in the Hindu tradition, misquoted by scholars who should know better. You have to, what does Sat mean? You have to get the meaning in context. Turns out that, that's one verse in a hymn. If you look at the prior verses of the hymn, they're talking about different forms of God. Like Vishnu, like Agni. If you look at the next verse, it's talking about different forms of God. Like Aryama, God of the ancestors. So if the prior verse is talking about gods, and the next verse is talking about gods, that word Sat doesn't mean truth. It means God. So we now get the proper understanding. Ekam Sat. Let's use the word Ishvara, give up the God. Ishvara is one, and the wise ones describe that one God in many ways. This is a central teaching of the Hindu tradition, comes right at the beginning of the Rig Veda, and it certainly is worth paying attention to and let it inform all of our thinking about the Hindu tradition. Now, with that in mind, we can answer Gomati's question. Mantras originated from the four Vedas. There are plenty of mantras that don't originate in the four Vedas. They originate in the Puranas, they originate in Itihasa, other scriptures as well. But we would say that the four Vedas are indeed the foundation for the entire Hindu tradition. That's correct. But it's not correct to say that all of our mantras originate in the Vedas. Have you ever recited a mantra to Lord Krishna? Probably. I'm being a little silly. Do you think that mantra came from the Vedas? And I'm kind of playing with this because the Vedas came obviously before Sri Krishna. Okay, so, and let's see. And the mantras are not specific to any god. That's absolutely untrue. Starting with the first, in the very first verses of the Rig Veda, Agni is worshipped. There are mantras to Agni. There are worship mantras to Varuna, god of the waters. There are plenty of mantras to specific forms of God, starting from the very first verse of the Rig Veda. But they're not verses to different gods, right? They're verses to the one and same Ishvara, who is worshipped with different names in different forms. And with that, we can understand, well, why do we have so many mantras to each god? We just answered that. Why rituals to different forms of God with different mantras? All of that is answered. One part of her question, most of the stories I've heard so far from the Upanishads talk about Brahman Tattvamasi. So actually the Upanishads do actually speak of other, there are plenty of Upanishadic references to Indra and other forms of God. So this points to something that Gomati, I'll give you my interpretation of what's going on here. I think Gomati was raised in a pious South Indian family. I'm saying South Indian because her name is Gomati, which is in Sanskrit Gomati. It sounds Tamilian to me. I might be wrong. a pious family, but a very modern thinking family who might have rejected the ritualism of the Vedas and focused more on the purely spiritual teachings of the Upanishads. If my guess is correct, Gomati is fortunate to be raised in such a family. But here's an issue, I think. Every Hindu raised in a Hindu family, whether the Hindu family is in India or in this country, wherever, what we learn in our families is not necessarily the essence of what the Hindu religion is. We learn according to what our parents and our grandparents learned. And our parents and grandparents are, they're wonderful. We love them, but they're not omniscient. And so with that in mind, I guess one point, an important point to be made here, is that we grow up with certain religious teachings. When we become adults, we need to educate ourselves properly. That's all. Whatever religious teachings you received as a child were wonderful. And even if you, but Swamiji, it was no Advaita Vedanta when I was raised as a child. I don't care. If it was a religious upbringing, you were lucky. If you didn't have a religious upbringing, I think you missed out on something. Anyone raised in a religious family, and any religion, I would even include non-Hindu religions. I was raised in a Christian religion, blessed me tremendously. And I really feel that anyone raised in any religious tradition is blessed by their religious training as children. But the fact remains, when we grow up and have adult minds, we need to revisit all the teachings that we received as children. We have to learn how to discern, to let go of some childish beliefs we had and to understand our religious traditions from an adult perspective. Next question from Eugene. Doesn't say where Eugene lives. He says, you often mention in your talks that realization of Atman is not an experience. Realization is a word I don't often use, in fact. So I say that the discovery of your true nature as Satchidananda Atma is not an experience. I don't use that term. Realization of Atma is already problematic. What do you mean by realization? It's one of these fancy words. We like things that sound impressive. Oh, realization. The Sanskrit term that is patterned after, it's not a direct translation, but the closest Sanskrit term is Atma Sakshatkara. Sakshatkara means to have something immediately present. So an immediate recognition. In fact, the word recognition is another problem. Anyway, there's another Sanskrit word for recognition. Anyway, there's no direct translation. There's no one-to-one equivalence for many words. And I would say that the word realization is not a direct translation of any Sanskrit word. It's an English word that we like. And there's nothing wrong with it. I'm just making a point, and the point is, it sounds exotic. If I say knowledge of Atma, boring. If I say discovery of Atma, which is a word I prefer, it sounds a little better. But still, it's like you discover something at the market that you've not seen before. So, but realization sounds really impressive. You get my point. Language is a problem here. And it's relevant to Eugene's question. You mentioned in your talks that realization of Atma is not an experience. However, Swami Sarvapriyananda, in his recent talk, described it as an experience as follows. And he gives this is a very good quote of Sarvapriyananda. I've not met him, but I know very well who he is. He is a very good teacher of Advaita Vedanta. In fact, in the Ramakrishna mission, I think there's no one who understands the teaching of Shankaracharya better than Swami Sarvapriyananda. Which means, if my teachings are based on Shankaracharya, and Sarvapriyananda's teachings are based on Shankaracharya, we would expect them to be similar, right? Watch this quote. This is Sarvapriyananda who says, what Advaita Vedanta says is not faith, not even extraordinary mystical experiences, but just our day-to-day experience, our experience of being the subject who experiences object, our day-to-day experience of waking, dream, deep sleep. This is enough to start with, and we use these experiences to make philosophical inquiry and see for ourselves what the true nature of consciousness is. The interesting thing here is you will not come to a theoretical conclusion because consciousness is direct and immediate for us. Whatever we discover about consciousness, that's an... So let me just stop here. Any divergence between what Sarvapriyananda said here and what I teach? I don't understand why Eugene thinks that it's different. I don't see a shred of difference. Now, if you try to make a difference, you might find, so I'm pointing back to that realization word. At the very end, Sarvapriyananda says, whatever we discover about consciousness, that's an experience. Whatever we discover about consciousness, that's an experience. That's experiential by its very definition. Is Sarvapriyananda saying that it's experience that makes you enlightened? Whatever you discover about consciousness is an experience. He uses that same word I use, discover. And experience, by the way, experience includes all of your thoughts, including a thought that gives you knowledge. When you make a discovery, is that an experience or not? Every thought, everything that happens in your mind is an experience. So what Swami Sarvapriyananda said very nicely here is exactly in agreement with what Shankaracharya teaches and with what I teach, and that is enlightenment is not the result of an experience. And there's nothing that Sarvapriyananda said here that controverts that. Enlightenment is not an experience. Well, enlightenment is an experience. I'll give you a little nuanced thing. How's this? Enlightenment is a normal experience of an extraordinary subject matter. If you want to call it, because anything that happens in your mind is an experience, including a discovery of your own nature as Satchidananda Atma. That's an experience. But it's an experience exactly as the same as you experience what's happening right now. It's not an extraordinary experience. It's just the way your mind works. So, the focus on that word experience is highly problematic. The use of the word realization is an attempt to turn Vedanta into, by the way, I'm not criticizing Eugene. I don't think Eugene necessarily goes for this. This is a teaching called Neo-Vedanta. And this Neo-Vedanta teaching, I have to say, is prevalent in the Ramakrishna mission, from which Swami Sarvapriyananda comes. Many teachers in that Ramakrishna mission, ascribe to a doctrine that scholars now call Neo-Vedanta. And in this doctrine called Neo-Vedanta, enlightenment is indeed an experience. Now, Sarvapriyananda is an outlier in his group, and my congratulations to him for doing so. So, by the way, this is not to criticize anyone, but just to this is a really important point. There's a fixation on experience, therefore discovery of Atma is not good enough, realization of Atma. Okay, I think I've gone up enough about this. One of my rants, as it were. Anyway, very, very nice question from Eugene. Next question from Amit, who lives in India. Mentioned that our past life memories do not carry forward as the brain stores memories. Well, we know this very well. The memories, the question that comes, everyone asks in this satsang as well, Swamiji, why don't we remember what happened to us in our past lives? This question is asked a lot, and in ancient times, it wasn't well understood. In modern times, very well understood, and that is that memories, specific memories, are stored in the neurons of your brain. Your brain doesn't survive death. Those specific memories do not get conveyed from one life to another. However, we've said on many occasions that certain samskaras, deeply embedded mental impressions might, not necessarily, they might be conveyed from one life to the next. And Amit makes reference to this. When the body perishes, memory is destroyed. So what's carried forward are samskaras from current past lives to the next. So it will not require a subtle memory of some sort. Some people will invent this concept of subtle memory. But he's leading up to his question. So first of all, that statement is completely in keeping with what we've discussed here. But his question comes here. Enlightened people, let me paraphrase. Suppose someone is enlightened and they happen to get dementia, like Alzheimer's. They lose, sad. Many of you know people who have suffered from Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. An extremely sad condition, the loss of mental faculties, including loss of memory and so much more. Yeah, it's just very sad. So the question comes is, an Alzheimer's patient might lose complete memory of what they learned in life. If the Alzheimer's patient was a highly skilled computer programmer, do you think they can do that work any longer? It'll be gone. So they lose a lot, and I suppose they lose a lot of personal memories as well, maybe from specific parts of their lives. I don't know the details. Certainly, you can lose it's possible to lose almost anything. So the question comes from Amit and others, can an enlightened person lose enlightenment? That's a very good question. And here, enlightenment, if we use the word mukti, and I'll remind you a topic we've discussed here before, two kinds of mukti, jivan mukti and videha mukti. Do you remember these terms? Jivan mukti, enlightenment while you're alive. Videha mukti, enlightenment after this life has come to an end. So, what about jivan mukti? It's pretty complicated. We define jivan mukti as freedom from suffering in this lifetime. But when you're what we have also said, and this is important, is enlightenment does not remove the experience of physical pain or emotional pain. We've differentiated many times between pain and suffering. So pain is a physiological or emotional fact, an inescapable fact of having a human body and mind. Suffering, as we've said, is optional, and hopefully the teachings of Advaita Vedanta can lift you out of those. Not hopefully. If you are on the right track, the teachings of Advaita Vedanta will lift you out of that suffering. So an enlightened person who is suffering from a physiological disorder that causes pain will experience the pain and will not suffer as a result of that pain. An enlightened person who has Alzheimer's will experience the disorder of the mind. It'll be the same for an enlightened person as it would be for any other person. The disorder will be experienced. Now, what makes it complicated is how to define suffering. And to be honest, I don't know where to go with this. How to understand the suffering of an Alzheimer's patient. I don't know what the experience is to have Alzheimer's. If I were to have dementia, I'm not sure what would happen in my own mind. One thing we know is that there's a difference between jnana and jnana phala. Jnana, knowledge, and in our context, self-knowledge, enlightenment, and jnana phala, the fruits or results of that knowledge, of that enlightenment. And what we could say, and what my own guru, who addressed this question many times, what he said is, for someone who is enlightened but suffers from Alzheimer's or some form of dementia, they may be enlightened, but due to the disordered nature of the mind, they may be unable to enjoy the fruits of that enlightenment in this lifetime. That's exactly what my guru taught. So definitely Alzheimer's is a big deal. And it can prevent an enlightened person from enjoying the splendor of being able to live a life free from suffering. That's with regard to Jivan Mukti. What about Videha Mukti? According to the doctrine of karma, when you get enlightened, your connection to all of your past karmas is severed immediately. So doesn't make any difference whether you have Alzheimer's or not. Doesn't make any difference if you die immediately or if you die when you're 120. Doesn't make any difference. At the moment of enlightenment, your connection to all your past karmas are severed. Therefore, those past karmas cannot affect you in future lives and cause enlightenment. Karmas can affect your body and mind in this life. That's the prarabdha karmas. And this again is the part of, not again, this is part of the technical, there's some complexity in the doctrine of karma. We differentiate between prarabdha karmas and sanchita karmas. Prarabdha karmas are those karmas which determine this particular life. Sanchita karmas are those karmas which do not bear upon this life, but will bear upon future lives. It's your connection to the sanchita karmas that's severed at the time of enlightenment. Not to there's no being severed from the prarabdha karmas. And that's nice. He's laughing because suppose at the moment of enlightenment, you are severed from your prarabdha karma. It's prarabdha karma that keeps your body alive. So at the moment of enlightenment, it's over. Silly, right? Okay, this is according to the doctrine of karma, which is a little complicated on this and some other topics. Okay, a few more questions here. Do we have any questions from any of you today? No? Okay. Yeah, you'll need the microphone. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you. Swamiji, I'm not very clear still. Whatever we are learning right now, does this carry over in the next birth or no?
Okay, that's a good question. What you're learning right now, does it carry over to the next birth or not? So what are you learning right now? If you're learning about Vedanta is stored in your brain, gone when you die. That doesn't carry over. Well, so the question, if you didn't hear, so we have to start over again in chapter 6 of the Bhagavad Gita. At the end, Sri Krishna talks about the yoga brashta, someone who fails to get enlightenment in this life, and it says that person will pick up the thread in the next life. So the goal then is get enlightened now. Why wait? I have to just observe that so many people, especially those raised in Hindu families, say, I'll devote myself to Advaita Vedanta after I retire. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this statement, and that's always baffled me, because the teachings of Advaita Vedanta can make you free from suffering. Why would you want to wait until you retire to become free from suffering? I don't get it. So, the memories don't go to the next next life. We should get that now. Okay. Any other one more question here, please?
Just looking around, the number of gray hairs proves your point.
Yes.
So, my question was related to the upbringing. I'm surrounded by a lot of people I would call atheists. I have a hypothesis that Advaita and Hinduism accepts them, but I'm not sure. I just wanted to get your thoughts on how I want to talk to them in a way that they can it resonates with them. So I was just looking for some cues or any videos you have done on those.
Okay. Okay. By the way, I don't see all gray hair here.
Yeah, there's some exceptions.
We've got. Okay, I'll admit that the average age is 60-something, but there are a few young exceptions here in our audience.
And some are died.
We don't count that. Okay. All right. So what is a Vedantic perspective on atheism? Something of interest is that in ancient India, there were plenty of atheists. They were called Charvakas, was the term for that. And they weren't part of the culture. I don't think they were treated as outcasts or anything. It's a philosophical perspective. And sorry, let me pick up the train of thought. How about this? There are traditional schools of Indian philosophical thoughts. There are 6 darshanas, 6 traditional thoughts, schools of thought, of which at least 2 of them are atheistic. Surprise! Nice to see your reaction. There's such a thing as Nirishvara Sankhya and Nirishvara Mimamsa. So the Mimamsa describes the ritualistic school that predated Vedanta. They don't necessarily accept Ishvara as a god you pray to. They perform rituals because rituals work. So it's not a prevalent line of thought among Mimamsakas. Most of them were pious and very religious. But there were some in ancient times, and I don't know about modern times, who were not particularly religious not religious is not the right word. They practiced rituals without bhakti. Rituals were practiced for a very pragmatic reason in this Nirishvara Mimamsa. Then Nirishvara Sankhya. Sankhya is a major school of thought among the 6 darshanas. And some of them, there's nothing in Sankhya that says Ishvara, as you and I understand, exists. They will talk about Purusha and Prakriti, not Ishvara. So there's room from a Hindu philosophical perspective for atheists. And not surprisingly, because it's not surprising that some people are atheists. Now, how to deal with such people? First of all, here's something you may not have thought, maybe you've thought about this. Atheism is a belief system. Have you thought about that? Good, you got that. It's just another belief system. And any belief system might be true, might be false, we don't know. So therefore, somebody who says, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God, that's a belief, as they admit. No one can say with certainty, I know for a fact that there is no such thing as God. Who can say that? So I would say the agnostics are much more honest. An agnostic is someone who says, I don't know. Good, there's some real intellectual honesty in that perspective. One who says, I don't believe that God exists is a belief. And by the way, beliefs should be respected, right? If somebody believes in Jesus Christ, shouldn't that belief, if someone believes that accepting Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior will save you from eternal damnation, if somebody believes that, should you convince them that their belief is wrong? Who are you to judge someone else's belief? If the belief is helpful to them, then they're absolutely fine. So we should respect someone's belief if they believe that there is no God. Suppose someone says, I'm an atheist, I know for a fact there is no God. That's the person you should go after. Because they're confused. They don't know what a belief is. They don't know what knowledge is. They may believe there's no God, and they're entitled to that belief. But anyone who says, I know that there is no God, that person is not thinking properly, doesn't understand what understanding itself is, doesn't understand the difference between knowledge and belief. Anyway, so how to deal with atheists? Respect other people's opinions, respect other people's beliefs. But if they're really off in their thinking, and if you have a positive relationship with them, then maybe that's worth exploring some of the things we've just talked about here. Okay, I have a few more questions, then we'll wrap up for today. This question comes from Suresh, one of our local students here in New Jersey. With regard to a video, intimate encounter with your ego, ahankara. Ego, and in that in that video, I say ego is needed to engage in worldly activities, and we wrongly believe that to become enlightened or to gain liberation, the ego must be destroyed. That's a quote of mine from that. To believe that the ego must be destroyed is not, it's close to Advaita Vedanta, but not quite. There's a subtle error in that thinking. And that is, and that's what I teach in that video. If you're confused about ahankara, go and watch that video. It'll help a lot. So here's the point. Ahankara is a normal mental phenomenon. Normal people have an ego. It helps you when you say the word, it helps you say the word I. Notice suppose you had no sense of I. By the way, let's start. The Advaita Vedanta definition of ego has nothing to do with pride. Same for the word ahankara. No connection to pride at all. It's all, we use it in a technical sense. The feeling of being an individual person. Suppose you didn't feel like an individual person. And somebody says, "How are you today?" Who are they referring to? How would you reply? It's very, you have a sense of me. Oh, they're talking about me. How am I feeling today? If you don't have a sense of being an I, an individual person, how can you reply to that question? How are you today? And you say, "Oh, there's no me." Which is silly, right? It's facetious. Okay. By the way, it's silly. I'll come to this point later. I'll set it aside. So, ego is a natural part of the mind. Does enlightenment require the destruction of natural parts of your mind? Ishvara gave you a mind, so we should destroy it? Ishvara gave us a mind with an organizational principle called ego, I-ness, ahankara. Destroying it is undesirable, and I think I give this in the video. In the absence of ego, you become non-functional. Ego is absent in a state of meditative absorption. In a state of meditative absorption, can you do anything? You can't do anything. In order to use your free will, you need an ego to wield it, or involved in the wielding of free will. So anyway, intentional behavior depends on the presence of ego. In the absence of ego, if you're in a state of meditative absorption, there's no possibility of intentional behavior, so you become non-functional. So for this reason, the goal of Vedanta is not to destroy the ego, but rather to recognize the ego as merely a mental phenomenon that comes and goes like any other mental phenomenon. Generally, we don't think of the ego, we take the ego very seriously. Me. If somebody says something rude to you, who gets hurt? Who gets angry? Suppose the teachings of Vedanta make you understand that the person who's just been insulted is not you. So the person who's just been insulted has something to do with his body, something to do with his mind and personality, but it's not me, because I am Satchidananda Atma, I am pure consciousness. If that's your perspective, and someone casts an insult at you, it won't cause any reaction like that at all, because they're not insulting you. The ego, when you get it, that my true nature is pure consciousness, This sense of being an individual person is a mental phenomenon like anything else. That doesn't destroy the ego. It reduces its status from the true I to a mental phenomenon. So it's not true to say that we destroy the ego. If we want to say destroy, how about we destroy the reality of the ego? We destroy the ignorance-based notion that this is me, I am me. So the reality of that conclusion is what's destroyed. We take away the wrong notion. What gets destroyed is that ignorance-based notion that ego is me. So the ego remains, but in a way that no longer causes suffering. There's a trend. There's a metaphor. I think I've seen used several places. It's like when you burn newspaper, and it's just laying there. Sometimes the ash, it's not ash. Imagine burnt newspaper, you can still read it. You've seen something like that, right? It doesn't, not crumpled, not ashes, but it just burns and still maintains its form. So imagine they call it Dagda Bija Ahankara, is a Sanskrit term I'm trying to explain. The Ahankara, which is like a burnt seed, is a Sanskrit term, which is a little obscure concept, so that's why I'm giving this newspaper. So it's destroyed, but it's still present in a functional manner. It's no longer real. So to finish the question, however, my confusion arises, this is Suresh's question, when I read in Viveka Chudamani, and not just there, in many, many Vedantic scriptures that say that the emphasis is to remove the ego. Those verses need to be understood in a more nuanced way. Verses at a more shallow level will say destroy the ego. But that's at a shallower level. Verses at a deeper level will talk about what kind of destruction of the ego, not the utter eradication of the ego, but rather removing that ignorance-based notion that the ego is real. Okay. Final comment. Edit. Pardon me. It's not helpful. That's why. Okay. Next question from Nagarajan, who also lives here in New Jersey. For me, as a rational person, it's very tough to take the Puranas as anything but mythological and allegorical. At times, I feel, why would they have written these 18 Puranas and built stories about them and all of this? But recently, I thought about them, and a few things made me question the idea that they're mythological. And he goes on to give a number of reasons, beginning with the sages, Vyasa and Valmiki held values like truth very highly. So the Mahabharata is written by Vyasa, the Ramayana by Valmiki. Mahabharata, and they both have stories of chariots that fly. How are we, so are Vyasa and Valmiki, are they making this stuff up? They have chariots that fly. And we'll come back to that. Actually, let's deal with that right now. First of all, there's a problem with understanding the difference between what Vyasa wrote and Valmiki wrote and what we now call Mahabharata and Ramayana. Both of these scriptures had a historical origin and then historical stories that were elaborated upon by generation after generation after generation. When we studied the Mahabharata years ago, in the very first chapter of Mahabharata, it describes 3 different versions of the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata itself contains a record of 3 different versions of the Mahabharata. The first version, which may have been as short as 8,000 verses, if I remember right. And then it ballooned. This is interesting. There's a history of the Mahabharata. Started with 8,000 verses, we attribute to Rishi Vyasa. It then ballooned into number 2, which was about 24,000 verses. It then ballooned and ballooned and ballooned. I think the largest version is almost 100,000 verses. Start with 8,000, end up with 100,000. What's going on? Stories get added and added and added and added. This is how our scriptures work. That's true of the Mahabharata, it's true of the Ramayana, equally true of the Puranas. These are stories accumulate. And this is not to be critical. How wonderful it is. These stories add so much to the drama and intensity of these scriptures. Excuse me. Let me give you a very concrete example. I mentioned the adding things on and adding things on. In Pune, some decades ago, there was a group of scholars met, and they spent about 20 years going through every version of the Mahabharata that they could find, trying to see what's been added on since about the 17th or 18th century. They're trying to identify recent additions to the Mahabharata, not even ancient additions, just recent additions to the Mahabharata. So they wanted to create what they call a critical edition of the Mahabharata, and it's widely followed and acclaimed by scholars around the world today. Their work is fantastic. So the point is that they took all of the teachings that were popular in every corner of India, copies, some of which I think the largest ones are probably about 96,000 verses, if I remember the numbers correctly. The version they came up with has about 84,000 verses, which is still a lot. That means they went from 96 to 84. So I was curious, what got cut? I was very surprised to learn that the story of Draupadi's Vastaharana was cut. Meaning, prior to the 18th century, there is no record of that story. It's a fairly recent addition of a famous story of Draupadi's Vastaharana. Now, what's the take-home message of this? That's a wonderful story. So, is the take-home message, oh, we have to ignore all of this stuff? Where did that story come from? That story came from some very pious and scholarly teacher who lived hundreds of years ago, who, that scholarly teacher, was probably teaching in a satsang like this, not in English, obviously, not in America, obviously. So imagine several hundred years ago, a pious, scholarly teacher who spontaneously invents a story because it's a wonderful story with a wonderful message. And then, because this teacher is a little scholarly, writes out verses in the same style, which is not, by the way, the style of Mahabharata is a fairly simple, straightforward style. It's not hard. If you know Sanskrit well, it's not hard to compose verses in the style of the Mahabharata. Really, it's not a big deal. So several hundred years ago, some great scholar composed these verses on Draupadi's being disrobed by Dushasana, that famous story. And his verses were so powerful and so wonderful, they got incorporated into the Mahabharata. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? To me, that scholar enhanced the Mahabharata by adding that story. And if you say, but Swamiji, isn't that an addition? Sure. But so are most of the other stories are also additions. You go back to Vyasa's original 8,000 verse version, you won't find all those stories. The whole Mahabharata is a collection of stories. Not the whole. There's a historical core story. Everything else has been added on. So, in my opinion, it's really important to look at these two categories of scriptures, Itihasa and Purana. Itihasa, historical epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. Purana, the 18 Mahapuranas, 18 Upapuranas. All of these are collections of stories. All of these have, and bottom line, all of these have their sources in the teachings of great saints. All of them are exceedingly helpful and valuable to us. And none of them are historical records. They're not history books. None of it is in a form of history books. Now, Nagarajan concludes his question, should we not treat these Puranas should we not treat these Puranas as belief systems like Karma Yoga and not as mythological or allegorical stories to dismiss them as most Vedantins do? I'm a Vedantin. Did I just dismiss them? I said, what do you mean by dismiss? Did I say they're bad? Did I say you shouldn't study them, you shouldn't accept them? I said they're stories. Stories have a value. And the value of the story, this is such an important point. What is it that makes a story valuable? Even modern stories. What makes a story, and stories, by the way, by definition, are fiction. What makes a fictional story valuable? First of all, it's valuable if it moves you and you learn something about it. If it's an emotionally rich experience, if you gain some insights from that story, that's wonderful. That's the value of it. Does that value depend on its authorship? Suppose they discover there's a debate about which plays are truly from Shakespeare and which are not. Who cares? If you enjoy the play, it doesn't make any difference who is the historical author. So authorship is not the issue here, nor is authenticity. But it wasn't written by Shakespeare. Give me a break. The value of the story, it stands on its own legs. If it conveys something of tremendous value, who cares about its origin and authorship? Now, what does Nagarajan mean by dismiss? When we call it maybe the problem is with language, mythological. I don't generally use that word mythological, but nor am I against it either, because mythological means not historical. And the value of a story doesn't depend on its historicity. The value of the story of Draupadi doesn't depend on it being an actual historical event. It may have been. There's no way, but there's no way to know. It ends up being a matter of belief, does it not? And now, when we call it a matter of belief, and this, let me come back to his question here. Okay. Should we not treat these as belief systems like karma yoga? Absolutely. But notice, to call something a belief system is not to dismiss it. That's that word. There's the problem is this word dismiss. Will a teacher of Vedanta dismiss the doctrine of karma, saying the doctrine of karma is all mithya? Ye sab mithya hai. Many of teachers will take that approach. In my view, that's not a very skillful teacher. A skillful teacher is one who says the doctrine of karma is a belief system, and it's an exceedingly helpful belief system. So it is dismissed in the sense that it's not taken as a truth, like Brahman Satyam, Jagan, Mithya, including the doctrine of karma. So when we say that the world is not absolutely real, it's not that we're dismissing it. We're just saying it's not absolutely real. Same goes for the doctrine of karma, not absolutely real. We call it a belief system, a helpful belief system. In the same way, the teachings of Puranas and the stories of Mahabharata and Ramayana, whether they're true or not, is beside the fact. Belief systems are neither true nor false. The value of all of these scriptures is in their ability to help us. They're all exceedingly helpful, so none of that is dismissed in the sense of being labeled as unhelpful or not valuable. So I think a problem with English. So in my view, a skillful teacher of Vedanta will say that the doctrine of karma is a belief system, it's not a fact. The teachings of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are wonderful teachings. They're not all facts. There are probably some facts there in the core story, but many things have been added on, so it's not 100% fact. And the Puranas are no facts. There's nothing factual in the Puranas. They deserve, if you like the word mythological, mythological means non-historical. So when the example I keep giving is when Brahma Ji and Lord Vishnu got into a big argument about who's mightier, and they go to Shiva to mediate that argument. Did that argument take place on a Tuesday morning or a Thursday afternoon? You've heard me ask this question before. You get the point. It's not a historical event. So, enough said. The value of all these scriptures is to help us, and this word dismiss is problematic. A fictional story can be... I'll just end with this comment. Have you ever been transformed by a fictional story? It's just kind of touched you and informed you and encouraged you in an amazing way. You learned something from that fictional story that you couldn't learn anywhere else. So, the value of this whole tradition doesn't lie on historicity, lies on its inherent value. Okay, we'll conclude. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Abhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sat gamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityorma amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat. See you next time.